Welcome to SAR Technologies image recognition theory discussion for Searchlight Image Locator.
You all know in search and rescue that not finding the person or the target is very easy. You know, we fly around, we go through the woods, and often we don't pick people up on the first round, and maybe we do a day later or 2 days later, and maybe the public find them later on, and maybe their body gets found months later. You know, we've all had the experience of I'm sure, not finding the person, and it's very uncomfortable, of course. But there are reasons, and I'll show some of those as we go through this PowerPoint. Here's just an example. This is the site of an aircraft crash in the Olympic Mountains, Washington State, which is just across Georgia Strait. This is probably British Columbia right here. So we're just across Georgia Strait from Washington, D.C. And I've been over here to help on searches a couple of times. In this particular one, anyway, a plane went missing, it disappeared, and their aircraft were trying to find this crashed plane, and they couldn't. And then after a while, they got a cell phone call from the pilot. And he said, "I'm okay." So once they knew where he was, and not before, they of course flew over there, and this was the picture they took. And here is his plane. You can see this little thing here, right? This is the crashed aircraft. And of course, without knowing that ahead of time, you know, in this like broad range of mountain peaks like this, anyone could be forgiven for not spotting this little mark in the snow here. But it's the crashed plane, and what he did, he got out without injuring himself and walked up the slope to the ridge here and pulled out a cell phone and got cell phone reception on the ridge. And that's how he managed to call for help. So it certainly indicates, you know, there's no shame, and if you want to call it that, in not finding the subject. They can be extremely hard to find. And this is what I think we want to try and reduce, you know, this big challenge. So we're going to use a system called image recognition, which has been around for quite a while now, and it's deeply mathematical at its core, but we ignore that and we leave that to the professional mathematicians. I certainly don't understand the level of mathematics that they use. But the principles of how it operates are important because it's different from what you might think. We're not actually matching picture to picture. We're not saying, here's a picture of a person that looks like a picture of a subject. When we overlay them, that's a match. It doesn't work that way at all. It's not overlay comparison at all. It's much more sophisticated than that. And this is how it works. So you take a picture here, and basically you look at it in its pixel form as it's shown here. And then what the mathematics does, it takes every little edge and eyebrow and nose and nostril and chin and everything in there at very small segment levels, and it creates these little lines or curves, these tiny little edges, really. And each of these is represented by a mathematical formula. I mean, this is actually a slope, right? This is actually a flat area, and this might be the beginning of a curve. So all of these are represented mathematically. They're little mathematical chunks of numbers, if you want to call it that. And then you gradually assemble, like these are mini pieces of jigsaw piles. You gradually assemble these mini pieces through maybe 100 levels of scanning and assembling. It's not just one or two, maybe like 100 or 200 or something. And it gradually builds up components like these curves here. And that looks like it's probably an ear, or there's an ear. You know, maybe there's a nostril in there. And so it builds up bigger pieces. So fundamentally, it's dealing with small portions of an image, not the entire image at all, small portions. And then gradually it adds together these small portions through this training until they suddenly, oh gosh, there's a hairline, and there's eyes, and here's a nose, and here's a mouth, and there's a mouth. So it builds up, it literally assembles pictures from these core pieces that come from the pixels. So you go from pixels to edges to parts of the object, and then it assembles the parts into the whole object. So here's an example. So you've got the colored pixels, and they get built up into these, you see the same kind of shapes as above there, but this time you've got the color in them. And then they get assembled into these parts, which you see here. And these parts get assembled into bigger parts, as you see here. And then the bigger parts finally get assembled into something that we can recognize as an object. So that's basically how it works at a non-mathematical level. And then we can compare the pictures that we take during a search with what it expects to see as an image, because we've trained it with maybe 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 of a known, say, pictures of people or known pictures of vehicles. Right? So it's learned from the libraries that we've created. So that's fundamentally how it works, the image recognition part itself. So we can use this in various ways. And I actually have done all three of these on searches to get practical. We can look at CCTV footage. For example, here's people, these are actually missing people. I think this is one of your New Zealand searches. And there's one from the US here, from Washington, California, sorry, where the subjects were seen in convenience stores, and they managed to get these pictures of them from the CCTV footage. This is huge because it gives us the color of their clothing, and here, and also it gives, in this case, a distinctive pattern, which can be very useful. Now, the public may take pictures with their smartphones, or you may even have hold your smartphone out of the door of the helicopter and just have it taking pictures every 1 second. That's a pretty good way of collecting pictures, believe it or not. And it can identify things like a backpack in it, within an image, or the backpacker, the entire person within the image. And then, of course, there's drone imagery, which we get a lot of these days. And the example here is that here you've got green tents, and yet the software is capable of identifying a green tent on a green background. So even though the contrast isn't great there, it's green on green, the intelligence within image recognition can detect, if we segment enough, that there is something we can recognize, like a tent against a green background. Again, some of these are they're not genuinely from full scan searches, but they're samples to give you an idea of how it works. This is one of yours, New Zealand. So this is the people that you picked up in the woods. I think eventually they lit a fire, the aircraft saw the smoke, your guys flew in, and the smoke was coming out of this little hole opening in the trees here. And this is one of your pictures, and it's pretty hard to make out anything in there, but you see there is this little flash of orange. And I used the image recognition software, segmented it into segments, and this anomalous, unusual color could be picked up through the scanning process, because it's a color that's different from what you'd expect to see in a regular background. So it's just an example of how it can be used. All right. Now, this gets to the limitations of what we can do as humans and how we can avoid some of these problems by using technology. So basically, the eye, the smallest thing that the eye can detect is about 1/2 to 1 degree on the horizon. So like the moon just coming up on the horizon seems big, but when you directly overhead, it's a pretty small object. And we can't resolve below about 1/2 to 1 degree. So when you go and do the eye chart tests, that's exactly what they're doing there. You know, those letters are not at random. They're basically based from blocky shapes, and the blocky shapes are so that the ophthalmologist will know where you can stop resolving a shape. So when you can't see an A or an L, that is your limit of resolution. And that is exactly what we have here, our limit of resolution. So it's exactly the same as the eye chart. We can't change the properties of our eye, right? That's as good as we can get. So what I've done, I said, okay, for image recognition, because we're using software now, I'm going to use the smallest size. I'm going to give ourselves a safety margin here. And I'm going to make sure that we can take pictures that will at least make our target 2 degrees tall in the picture. So in other words, double what we could see with our eye, just to provide, in a sense, a safety margin, because it's hard to know how the eye correlates directly with imagery, as in images. So I just said, let's double it as our minimum. That should be reasonably safe. So what that means in practical terms, if you're flying along in a helicopter or you're looking on a ridge or something, if you take 2.3 degrees is the actual value used, that is the same as seeing a 2-meter person from 45 meters away. Right? They will appear as 2.3 degrees in your eye. So that you can see, you can detect 2.3 degrees when the person is 45 meters away. Below that, you may not. That is equivalent for a 6-meter high truck. In this case, it's the same angle as you also being able to detect a 6-meter truck from 149 meters away. So that is about the minimum that distance that you can safely recognize a 6-meter long truck. And continuing further, if you are looking for an 8-meter long aircraft, like a crashed Cessna, for example, your eye could detect that 8-meter tall aircraft from about 200 meters away. So these are all the same view angle from the point that you can see. So what this means in practice is, if we are flying looking for a target, if we're looking for a person, they shouldn't be more than 45 meters away. If we're looking for a long truck, this is more like a small little passenger van, they shouldn't be more than about 149 meters away. And if you're looking for an 8-meter long crashed aircraft, you shouldn't be more than about 200 meters away to be fairly sure of detecting them visually or by image recognition. So this is what's called in the scientific parley, the point of closest approach, right? This is, we want to be this close. That's that distance between the helicopter and the target, or the drone and the target, or the aircraft and the target. So when we go through the math of setting up how far the craft should be above the ground, these are the distances we're using. We have to know that we can resolve it within the image. Okay. Now,
Martin,
yes, go
can I
ahead.
ask a question there?
Yeah.
So you're suggesting if we're in a helicopter looking for a person, we should be flying at about 45 meters above the ground?
Actually, no, much lower. I'll show you, we'll get to that in a while, and I'll show you a bit later. Okay, that's just so we can get the image recognition to be able to pick it up.
Recognition, not detection.
No, image recognition. That will then give us detection. That comes later. I'll explain how those two link together.
I'll shut up.
No, that's fine. It makes sense. First pass, that's the way you would think it would be, but it's a bit more to it than that. Okay, so here's another limit to the human perception, which again, I didn't know until I started researching this stuff. There's a couple of things I didn't know about that. So I was testing out image recognition when I got my little GoPro cameras. I stuck them on the windshield of my car, and I was just driving around, because you can't be in the helicopter all the time, just seeing what worked. And here I'm driving into the shopping center near where I live, and of course I have to look out for people. I'm going slowly. Obviously, I don't want to drive into people, so I'm a little bit careful. But I'm actually driving this way up. So if can you see my cursor on your screens?
Mm.
Can you see my cursor on your screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm driving along this lane here. Oops, I may have to go back one. And of course, I can see this woman here pushing a shopping cart, and I can see another person there. I'm just sort of looking, but I'm driving, right? So I've got to be careful. Okay, there's two people here. And then I go and I park the car, blah, blah, blah. And then I get home and I then review these manually. And I run an I segment it, and I run an image recognition scan on this, thinking I'm going to pick up a couple of people. So when you actually do it, I was entirely wrong. There were actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people in that image, and I only saw 2. And there's a couple of reasons for this. It's 2 or 3. One, obviously I'm driving, so I've got to look where I'm going. Secondly, you've got movement, so the eye doesn't have time to process everything that's going on around it. Thirdly, and most critically, if we go back here, the human field of view that can detect an object is only 60 degrees. So our peripheral vision goes out to something like 130, 135 degrees, but this is peripheral. And I guess it's to do with the rods and cones, but we are only able to detect movement out here. I guess it's a threat response. But to resolve and, quote, know that we've seen an object, it has to be within this limited 60-degree field of view. And I was presenting this to one of my own team members a couple of weeks ago, and she works in neurology and looks at brain scans and has used image recognition, believe it or not, for looking at brain scan slices. And she was quite surprised to me. And she said, the human brain is lazy. She said, it can't process everything coming in. The brain wouldn't survive if it took in everything properly all the way around it. So what it does, it considers this the important region, and so it processes that. And he said, because the brain is lazy, it interpolates a bunch of the other stuff. It basically says, okay, that's a kind of a close enough approximation that I can live and survive, but it doesn't recognize, because these are out here, right? So it's basically the way the brain works that causes this to happen. So we have to remember that when we're looking for people. So now, if you look at this scan using image recognition with these 2 cameras, that gives us a total of 135 degrees between the 2 of them. There were, in fact, 5 people there, and I only saw 2. So by itself, that's not, I'm sure the scientists on this show will say, that's not a proof. No, of course it isn't. But it was an indicator that, okay, we've got to look at this a bit more carefully here. So 5 people were detected. So we got multiple detections. The software can detect a partial image of a person. It doesn't have to be the whole person, because it's not pattern matching, right? It's not this overlay, one on top of the other. It can detect like a couple of arms. It can detect a leg or 2. It can detect the torso. And it also doesn't care whether the object is rotated, because it's built on those little mathematical components that I showed you earlier. And it does the assembly, and it doesn't care if half of it's missing or if it's rotated. It just treats it mathematically as their equivalent within those smaller collection of objects. So that's a hugely powerful benefit for us in detection. We don't need to see the full object standing the right way up, basically. And of course, if we record images as we're doing our searching, we have a permanent record that we can then review later on, which gives us a second level of detection, which is, I think, is our weakest part of what we do in SAR. We just don't know it. We don't deal with it because we haven't had an opportunity to do any better, but we can now. Okay, so this is getting to something practical. This is real world. This is a search down in Joshua Tree, California. So this was a Canadian that had been missing down there for about 2 or 3 months at that point. And the Park Service ranger covered my costs to come down there and fly over this area to look for this guy that had been missing, see if we could find his body, basically, at that point. And it was very, very, very rough terrain. It's all like this. It was absolutely blazing hot. and they'd had multiple searches through the area. But here I've used the math to come up to show what we're actually doing when we fly with this. So what we're doing, we have two, in this case, you can use a drone with one camera. Two is better because you get twice the coverage per flight, and it's also less processing. We have one camera pointing slightly left and the other camera pointing slightly right, but because they're kind of cone shaped, we permit a little bit of visual overlap in the middle, so that as we fly along our track line, we don't have a gap in the middle of our images, right? So there's a little bit 10-degree overlap side to side here. What we're doing, we're making sure by the height above the ground that we have a minimum of 1.5-degree view angle at the furthest high detection region here, and the maximum, in this case, 3-degree view angle at the closest point of approach. So basically what we're seeing, every picture we take, although it'll be bigger because these are wide angle lenses, every picture we'll take will have, by this configuration of height above ground level and speed, will have a high detection region never less than 1.5 degrees and up to about 3 degrees here. And if we find them out here, well, we're lucky, but we want to give the software the best chance of finding the subject. So we want to make sure that we completely cover this region and we don't miss anything. So this is how it works. And this happens to give you at 75 feet above ground level, a high detection region here. It's about 188 meters wide and about 29 meters in length. And that's with each camera having a 70-degree field of view, one to the left, one to the right. So that's the flying we did down in Joshua Tree. That was the idea here. If you're searching for an aircraft, you can go up to 500 feet and you get a whopping bigger area here. You can see about 1252 meters by 196. That's because the aircraft is 8 meters tall and the person's only 2 meters tall. So we can cover a much larger area if we're looking for an aircraft. So this is what we did. You fly along this track line. And what we're doing a grid in this case, because there's no real drainage. We just need to cover the whole area. So basically you fly up this track line, taking a series of overlapping pictures like this. And then you move across and then you fly back down this side. And that gives us a track spacing in this example of 169 meters. So we get full coverage of 4 pictures like this, all the way up and down the complete length of the track lines. So basically this is photogrammetry. We're setting this up really as photogrammetry, so we can be sure when we finish that we have full coverage of the search area. Okay. Any questions at that point before I move on? No? Okay. So what are our requirements for these pictures? Well, we want high resolution images, the highest resolution we can get in our cameras, lots of pixels. We want a stabilized camera. We don't want blurring. I got some blurring when I tried to use gimbals. I actually had to take the gimbals out of the helicopter. They made matters worse, actually. Lots of memory, which means you need good SD cards. That's not really a problem. They're big enough. And crucially, you must have, or you don't need to, but you really ought to have GPS location logging on, so we get the coordinates for every single image. If you don't do that, you have to spend a lot more time later on figuring out where each picture was taken. So you want to triply make sure that whatever you're using as your camera, whether it's a drone or a GoPro or your phone, absolutely triple check that location is turned on. This I've changed. We're no longer using forward looking. We're looking straight down now. I should change that slide. But this gives us multiple, as we fly along this track line here, it gives us multiple overlapping images. There's about a 10% overlap between each image. And you see we get complete area coverage. That's the goal here. So we can at least have the confidence that we haven't got any holes in where we've taken pictures. Okay, just say something whenever you want, because I can't.
Can I just
Yeah,
why the change from forward looking to downward looking? Doesn't that not perspective sort of decrease the, I guess, the vertical size of the target that you're able to see?
yes, yeah, you're sort of right. I mean, that was, for the longest time, I felt, again, it wasn't entirely mathematically proven, although I knew if you point the camera straight down, technically they should be bigger because they're a closer distance. My concern was that if you're looking head on or top down on a person, they're going to be small, right? You're going to get a top down view, which is a smaller area. But that isn't the case for a vehicle. It isn't the case for an aircraft or a ship or a shipwreck or anything like that. It may be for people, but a lot of people tend to be sitting down or at an angle or something like that. But the main reason wasn't even that. The main reason was I knew we could see, quote, as far as the horizon, right? And as we approached the subject, my erroneous thinking was, we'll get more pictures of the person, if it's a person, because we can see right out to the horizon rather than just straight down below. And so I felt that would give us more opportunities to detect them. It wasn't until I did a very thorough, I went through the math again, and then I looked at pictures that we'd taken looking straight down, which I hadn't done before. I realized that what actually happens is that they cross the field of view, that you might typically get 4 or 5 images of, say, a small tree or a person as it goes across the field of view, and that is enough to give the image recognition at least, say, 5 pictures to scan and work on, and they're closer. And all of that gives us better detection, and crucially, it reduces dramatically the number of images and segments we have to scan, because that goes up massively once you start putting the camera forward. You simply have to do a lot more onerous back-end scanning, and there was no benefit from it, it turns out. So that's why I've changed it to looking down. It took me, a couple of years to get there, but that is the preferred way to go now, and the math shows it.
That's really interesting. I've done some sort of photogrammetry work in a previous role before, and we was always looking, directly down. But that was obviously, we were looking at. I guess there was some object recognition and counting, but objects that were, I guess, ubiquitous in the image, trees and those sorts of things. So you were, you knew they were there. You weren't looking for them, so to speak. You were just trying to identify and count. But then you do get some interesting perspective. Well, I don't know if you call it a parallax or something like that, with certain lenses and things from a certain height that can distort. So do you find that, or is that a specific sensors and lenses that you would recommend, or?
Well, I haven't got into much of that. I just use GoPros,
Okay.
because of the ubiquitous. I mean, I didn't like the looking down. I had some original images that were all taken straight down during a big search we had here. We never found the guy, and I found it unpleasant. I didn't look like looking straight down vertically through the trees. You couldn't see much. You couldn't see what was coming. I think my brain was saying, I don't like looking this way. I like to see, quote, where I'm going. And I think that comes into it. But once you take that out of the picture, it does appear to be better. It's just that it's not a natural way to look at things, I guess, is the problem.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. So here's our aerial image considerations we have to think about. For what we do, the target is just a small portion of the image. It's not like portrait photography, where they fill the picture. We have a massive SAR challenge, is that usually our target is a small fraction within a small fraction of the image. And so we have to deal with that by flying a stable flight as low as possible to the ground to make this target as big as possible. And if we're doing, say, a grid plan, we should be following a grid pattern. We should always be GPS logging. If we're following drainages, we should log everything, as in GPS log, so we can pick up the tracks and look at them later, and then select which areas to scan first. And then we need to use image segmenting, which is what we'll talk about later, to improve the recognition. Basically, the software isn't very good at picking up, if it's not designed to be, a small target in a big picture. Right? There's a few new cases out there. It's called YOLO, you only look once, where they're starting to be able to do that, and in a later iteration of the software might be able to do that. But for right now, it's what is called in the industry classification. It expects the entire picture to be used. Well, we don't want that because this green clearly isn't a person, right? So what we do is we segment each picture for aerial. I'm not talking looking through security footage, but for aerial pictures, we segment each image in the software on the web page so that the goal is that the target essentially completely fills the segment. And that gives the image recognition the best chance of finding the target. What I found is that once the segments get more than about 30% bigger than the target, the effectiveness gradually tails off. So we want to get nice and tight. And basically the segments should be essentially the same height as the target is the goal. So we can look for crashed aircraft, we can look for vessels, crashed helicopters, people, vehicles. And right now I had about 10 or 11 categories. I think it's now up to 16. I basically made custom libraries for people in outdoors, vehicles, crashed aircraft, crashed helicopters, SOS, oil spills, and shipwrecks. So these are all custom SAR libraries. All the other categories come straight from the back-end vendor that I'm using, which can give us, they're not trained per image, they're trained by keywords, but basically that expands the range to include things like people by appearance, by their racial characteristics, by their age, by their sex. There's other things like it has travel pictures, food pictures. Basically, there's a whole set of pre-canned libraries that I am hooked into as well. So it becomes a multi-purpose tool. An important one is patterns, which I'll show you later. But for us, these are the key custom libraries made specifically for what we do, which are these ones you can see here. And we can use various aerial platforms. We can use helicopters, fixed-wing planes for the larger objects like aircraft, and drones, of course, much better for looking at people, helicopters and drones for looking at people closer to the ground. Okay, now this is the important stuff. This is where you guys, basically, you're kind of on the leading edge where you have to try and convince the volunteers or the police agencies, why should we do this? What is the driver for all this extra work? And there are some significant drivers. The key one for the responder is that they have enhanced capability. It makes them better responders. They're better at doing their job. There's a significant increase in search area size compared to walking on the ground. So for the same size team, we can get, by putting them in the air, typically 50 to 200 times the search area coverage just by getting the drone in the air or getting a helicopter up with searchers in it. We know that instinctively. We just know that there's a sort of bit of problem with detection, usually when we do that. But of course, we do this because we know it dramatically increases our area coverage. So what we need to do now is increase the detection at the same time. So we can effectively double the coverage compared to the visual search. And this is a very round number. Well, I'll show you where this comes from later. We can maybe increase the detection by, let's say, up to 6 times compared to a standard ground visual search. Now that's a big statement, but I think it's relevant and I think it's more or less real, partially for those things I've shown you before, like the narrow field of view of the human eye, the moving target, so on. And I'll show you where this comes from a bit later. Importantly, image recognition can detect a rotated or partially visible object. So that is really good. That's much better than just having to see the whole target. That's because of the mathematical smarts that have been built into image recognition. It increases our responder safety in dangerous terrain. You know, if you've got a nasty avalanche-prone mountainside, you don't have to necessarily have people on it. Just scan across it with a drone or with helicopter GoPros, and just film the whole darn thing. You know, and then look at that imagery afterwards. If you don't spot them in the air, then scan them afterwards. So this provides us an opportunity to stay out of some high-risk locations while still getting decent detection. Obviously, crevasse terrain, you know, will be another area, an avalanche-prone slope, and there are so many of them where we can use this. It also permits these, you know, all-important windows of opportunity, you know, where you suddenly get an opening in the cloud. You've got, oh, you've got 1 or 2 hours here, and that's it, you know. The bad weather's coming in. The best thing to do is get your team in the air, get your drones going, and get cameras just recording everything, kind of like a dash cam on your car. Just record everything, because you may not get back in there. You know, you'll come back out, the clouds would have closed in, and you may be down for 2 or 3 days. So this definitely allows us the opportunity to maximize these brief windows of opportunity.
Sorry, Martin, can I just ask a question, please?
Yeah.
So one of your first slides, you know, showed the human eye and looking at angles from a horizontal viewpoint. So
Yeah.
my question really is, to your mind, is this kind of intrinsically linked to drones, helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, or is there an application where people might actually be walking with, as they do, with GoPros on their chest, like the police, some of the police, and you know, are on there around here, or?
Mm-hmm. Oh,
here you've only talked about an application up in the air.
Yeah, it's not limited to that. The other parts where it can, yes, you can use it. You know, there's a number of ways you can use it. One I touched on is looking at, say, security footage. You know, where you've got, we've had people missing, as you probably have. You know, they go through a ski lift cashier, you know, where they buy their tickets, right? Or they go to a gas station or a convenience store. Yep. But all of that, right? You can just take those images. You don't need to segment them because they're close up, and you can scan at about 3,500 images per hour, like directly, just using, say, CTV footage. Another thing I thought of doing, which we never did because you don't get onto anything, was we had a crashed aircraft missing in the high mountain Rogers Pass area, east of Vancouver. And what I thought we could do, it never happened, was you could set up a camp there, you know, get a guy with a high-powered digital camera looking across at the opposite face and just slowly scanning it, you know, taking pictures all the way across, doing a little grid, dropping the camera, you know, a few degrees, scanning back in the reverse direction. We've got some big peaks here, like, you know, like Mount Baker and Mount Rainier, where, you know, sometimes climbers get stuck. You can't get there, but, you know, maybe you could set up a fixed high-power camera at the lodge, for example, you know, or the cabin, and just have that slowly scan. At night, you could use FLIR or infrared on it. You know, at daytime, you could just basically scan across the face back and forth and put those through. So yeah, you can use it anyway. Yeah, you could also put it, I guess, on the helmet of the responders. You know, I haven't even considered that yet, but they might miss something too. Yeah, if you're looking, you know, down a ridge line or across opposite slope, you know, maybe afterwards that head-mounted camera would pick up the, you know, the person that they missed. There's no reason not to. It's just about how much you want to process. You know, I'm just trying to optimize here, you know, but yeah, not every case is optimal, of course.
No, thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, so of course what we get out of this is the benefit is we've got a permanent record of our coverage, you know, which is massive, right? It's not just done and gone, which is what we usually have, and we've no idea if we've missed anything. We just don't normally operate that, or haven't normally operated that way in the past. But this provides a second opportunity to review the imagery, both as a simple review, visual slideshow style review, or to then follow on with scanning afterwards. And this together, you put these together, all of these raise the POD, right? The second review after the flight or the mission can increase the POD, and then scanning can increase the POD again. So we're basically trying to ratchet up that POD by having 3 levels of approach here. And we can scan thousands of images an hour. So there are benefits. Now, this is basically a simple representation of, so an aircraft flies along, and as it flies along the track line, it's taking these pictures, say, every 1 second. And then it reverses and comes back this way. And so we get each of these as separate images overlapped by about 10% in this particular way of doing business. And then we can scan each one of these and maybe find this structure when we look in that particular image. Now, this is where the ground guys need to know what happens here. This was a search we did up in central BC. It's forested, but it's more rolling forestry. It's not steep, rugged, field country stuff that you have and we have on the coast in British Columbia. This is more rolling forested hillsides, and these are clear-cut logging slashes. So obviously it's quite accessible to vehicles. And this guy left his truck. He was going to go to the dump, I think it was, to dump some stuff off, and he disappeared. So they knew he'd gone in his pickup truck, and they couldn't find him for a couple of days. So we were setting up, so okay, maybe we can take pictures of the area, see if we can pick up his vehicle. So I wound up doing the math and planning for this, and eventually he was found before we did it. He was found deceased. I guess he had a heart attack or something. But what they were faced with was this maze of logging roads and clear cuts, like an enormous area to search. And it's really too high for aircraft to be terribly useful. Oops. And it's too much for ground pounders on the ground. So a lot of it has to be vehicles and helicopters. So if you do the math, let me just think I went forward the screen here. Okay. If you do the math, 3 searches for 6 hours can roughly cover about 1 square kilometer on the ground, which is this size here. You put those 3 people in the helicopter looking out the windows, they can cover 51 square kilometers in the same time. That's 50 times larger search area from an above ground perspective. Now, that is enormous, right? It's enormous. We instinctively know that, which is why we put the searches in the air as much as possible. But this puts a number on it. We can cover 50 times the area as long as we can get better detection. And sometimes from the helicopter, not far above the ground, say 100 feet or so, we can get better detection. So we just have to get more serious about how we do this so we can improve that detectability. Now, if the target becomes bigger, if instead of being 2 meters, it's 4.5 meters or 6 meters, this is actually 4.5, this same coverage is now 216 square kilometers. So we've gone from 1 to 50 looking for people, and we've gone up to over 200 looking for a truck. And we can do this because the camera can be higher. We can be higher above the ground because we're looking for a bigger target. So that means in the same time, we can cover literally 216 times more area looking from the air for a truck than a person on the ground. So this is simply because of the view angle and the size of the truck allows us to be further away, and we can cover a larger area, and we don't need to take as many segments. So it's basically win all round. We do a better job if we do it this way. Basically. We just have to adapt the way we're searching. So these are really strong drivers for adapting the way that we search, I believe. Okay. So it increases our operational capability. We can cover 50 to 200 times bigger area. And what is really useful here is that it fills the major operational gap between the aircraft, which are typically too high and too fast, and traditional ground-based small area searching. You know, we often have used aircraft on our searches, and they seldom find anything. Our targets are just too small. They're typically too high up, they're too fast. For safety reasons, they can't go below about 500 feet above the ground, maybe even 1,000. And they just don't, they're not looking for aircraft, they're looking for vehicles or people. They just don't find them. And yet our ground operated searches, you know, they're covering too small an area. So this really allows the responders to fill this huge operational gap quite effectively by basically using drones and helicopters with people with searchers in and taking imagery. So it's really, it fills the gap. Yeah.
Thank you. Look, can I just, I'm not sure I understand what the comparison is for your 50 to 200 times. Are you comparing a team of searchers on the ground versus searchers using imagery? Is that 50 times?
What I'm comparing is 3 searches for 6 hours.
Yep.
3 searches for 6 hours can cover about 1 square kilometer on the ground looking for a person.
Yep.
And about 50 odd square kilometers if the same 3 people spend 6 hours in a helicopter looking for a person.
Yes.
Or the same 3 people for 6 hours in a helicopter looking for a truck. So it's the same 3. How do you use the 3-man team? Is what it is for 6-hour day. So these are the 3 sizes of coverage you get.
Sorry, Martin, you disappeared there after you said 3 searches on the ground for 3 hours, or you
3
put them
searches
in
for
a
6
helicopter.
hours.
Yep, 6 hours.
Right. And then 3 searches for 6 hours in a helicopter. And then 3 searches for 6 hours in a helicopter looking for a truck.
And are they using the imagery in the helicopter, or is it just their eyes?
No, all I'm saying here is that this is just simply travel time. This is simply based on travel time.
Okay.
Right. That is the coverage. It's not with the tech. It's simply the area coverage we're talking about.
Okay, understood. Thanks.
Okay.
Nick, your voice is breaking up. I don't know if you need to use a microphone or you're too far away from your computer.
No, I've got a microphone. It's a poor connection. I keep losing Martin.
And how's everyone feeling? Do they want to have a break? We've been going for an hour. Do you want to go for another 15 minutes and have a break, or how do you feel?
Crack on.
Okay.
Yeah, happy to crack on.
Okay.
All right, we'll carry on. Yeah, I'm sorry this can't go quicker, but I'm afraid you might not take it in if I go too much faster, right? There's a lot to chew on here. But yeah, we'll stop maybe when you want, maybe another quarter hour. So there'll be a natural break at some point here. Okay, moving on. So one way is to follow drainages. I definitely recommend following drainages. It's much more, drainages and routes. It's much more efficient of processing time. Sometimes you can't do that, such as Joshua Tree, and you have to do the grid pattern. So this basically says we can create KML flight plans that will give it this, what I'll call a photogrammetric overlapping image pattern, so that we know we've got all the coverage. That's what this red track is here. It's basically a KML track. So we're designing for maximum coverage, maximum duration of flying, the maximum detection by keeping as close to ground as possible, maximum recognition by having complete stable imagery without blurring. And the image parameters are set up by the camera angle, its pointing angle, the field of view of the camera, the target perspective, depending what angle we're looking at the target, and the image resolution. So there's a lot of factors that go into coming up with these flight plans. You don't have to see the math at all but they're all in there. You know, this is basically an end-to-end system that covers basically everything that needs to be done by taking essentially everything I can think of into account at any rate. So this is how it actually works. So basically, I said, okay, we want to fly the drone and we want to look for this person. Here's a flight plan. And it says, okay, we're going to fly for half an hour because it's a drone. They can't do an hour at a time. So let's say 30 minutes. And just in this is not a great example, but gives you a general idea. Flying at 10 kilometers per hour. So that's what we put in. And it says, okay, in this example, you need to be 200 feet above ground level. And you need to take a picture every 15 seconds. And you need to fly a track spacing of 68 meters. And I can move that out of the way. That'll give you a total track length of 5 kilometers. And that'll give you 111 images across that track, along the track. And that'll cover about 0.34 square kilometers. So basically all the parameters are in there. All this is pre-canned. No one has to think about this. There's tables on my website. They're all set up. You just pick the target type and it tells you your height and speed, altitude and camera interval. You don't have to know anything else. And track spacing. So all this is pre-done. Unless you're flying routes, but you still need to get the flight parameters for that, of course. Okay. So we'll stop in a minute for a break. We're getting close to where we can have a break. So this is the real world. This is image recognition being used on the search here at Cypress Bowl mountain just above my house. It's a ski hill. You can see it's a spring here. We're looking for a woman that was found. She was found deceased, and she was found just before. This is the RCMP police helicopter here, always called L1. And in this case, we've taken 2 GoPro cameras, and this shows the system in the hangar with 2 suction cups, which are there and there. And the suction cup clamp holds the GoPro, which is there. So there's 1 GoPro there, there's 1 GoPro there. And you can see these are more or less forward facing, but looking down. Ideally, a lot of the helicopters, they have like a footwell windows pointing basically straight down. So that's the preferred mechanism, but it's not essential. You know, there's a lot of field of view in these things. But here they were keen to go up, they wanted to go up. So I said, fine, okay. So we put the cameras in. Again, there's no FAA flight problems here, equipment authorization for flight in this particular case, because they're inside the windshield. So if you have a non-permanent system, then you can use this. You can just stick them in with the suction cups and off you go. Obviously, if it's a permanent thing, you have to have approved GoPro, in this case, GoPro housings, which are available, that you clamp on the skids. So that's the way we'll probably do it in future, once it's become standard practice. But this, you can see it's being used real time. And this little picture here shows one of the searches where my team were taking off, the Lions-based search and rescue, and the chopper's just taking off, and it's taking pictures. And these were a bunch of our searchers on the ground, just hanging out. You can see by their vests, jackets, and you see it recognized. And we said, oh, that's almost a 90% score for a person. Just happened to come in the field of view as it was taking off, to show that as an example. Okay, now I think we'll stop. This would be a good time for a break, and I'll show you how this was used on the search at Joshua Tree.